Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest Knoca event. It's an absolute pleasure to be launching a guidance document, which called "Making the Most of Climate Assemblies: A Playbook for Climate Civil Society Organisations." I'll get that out in a second, which has been written by Alina Averchenkova, who is known to many of you. She's a distinguished policy fellow at the Grantham Institute at LSE, but she's also one of the founding members of Knoca. She was one of the three people who came up with the idea. So I don't know, I think I'm grateful to her for coming up with it. It's been an enjoyable ride over the last 3 years or so. What we're going to be doing today is hearing from Alina. This has been a long time coming. So one of the things that Knoca is really interested in isn't just about how we run a good assembly, but how we engage with the ecosystem around assemblies. And recently we've been doing a lot of work on stakeholders, but very early in the early years of the Knowledge Network, it became very clear from our conversations with climate CSOs that they didn't always know how to position themselves in relation to assemblies. And Alina started this work where she started developing what she called a playbook. And almost a year ago, well, actually over a year ago, we ran a we ran a workshop on why and how should climate NGOs engage with climate assemblies. And even then, she was building this idea of a playbook. And over the last year or so, she's been working on this, talking to various people in the field, and finally the product has arrived. So it's absolutely fantastic. So anyway, Alina will be presenting this. Then we're really glad that Oisín Coghlan, who's the chief executive of Friends of the Earth Ireland, is going to join us for a brief conversation about his experience, his thoughts about how NGOs should position themselves, and any thoughts on what you said from Alina. And then we'll open it up to a discussion with others. So it's going to be a very sort of informal affair. Just to remind you, please do put details of yourself, introduce yourself if you like in the chat. Any questions you've got, stick them in the chat and we'll try and bring you in. We are recording, so if there's a point where we show everybody, then if you don't want to be seen, have your camera off. But other than that, I don't think anything unexpected it will happen. So it's my absolute pleasure to pass you over to Alina. I can tell you she is absolutely delighted that this is published, not only because she thinks it's an important piece of work, but she's really happy to get it off her desk as well, I think. So Alina, please tell us what have you been working on for the past 18 months, I think it is.
Thank you, Graham, for the generous introduction, and it's an absolute pleasure to share the final product with you today. Many of you who are today on the call actually contributed to this process and to this product, so I'm very grateful for that. Graham has challenged me to limit the presentation to 15 minutes so that we actually have good time for discussion. So I'm going to do my best to do that. So rather than focusing on the technical content of the playbook, I will give you highlights. And then when we go into discussion, we can zoom on any aspects which you found particularly interesting and talk more about that. So the playbook is available on the website as of today. And so I will talk briefly why we're focusing on climate assemblies in relation to civil society organizations. Why should they engage with climate assemblies? And then we'll present an 8-step approach that we developed in the playbook, followed by discussion. In case there are some people today on the call who are new to the subject, I just wanted to clear very briefly some of the key definitions that we will be using. So when we talk about public participation in climate policy, which is increasingly being recognized as an essential element of climate policy, what we mean is that direct engagement of everyday people, which is not to be confused with stakeholder engagement, which is a more structured engagement of organized interests such as civil society, business associations, trade unions, and political decision-making. And climate assemblies, of course, is a special form of public participation where a diverse group of everyday people come together to learn and deliberate about climate crisis and to develop collective recommendations. And importantly, those people are recruited through democratic lottery to represent represent and be similar to the average makeup of the society. So when we think about public participation, I think today there are some very clear reasons, especially seeing social backlash in Europe recently to climate policy, but also really the need to take into account the lived-in experiences of people in developing climate policies. Public participation can help break political deadlocks, deliver more robust and ambitious climate policy, reduce polarization around climate action, increase legitimacy, public acceptance, and promote more aware and politically confident citizenry. So we start a playbook with a discussion on why should civil society organizations, and particularly those who traditionally focus on climate change and not necessarily on public participation, why should they care about climate assemblies? When first of all, climate assemblies actually can provide very strong and legitimate basis for climate advocacy for civil society organizations. And that is one opportunity, as Graham mentioned, that we feel so far has been missed by many in the climate movement. Secondly, climate assemblies can actually help civil society organizations in their primary objectives of improving policymaking, debate, and action on climate. And they can also help rebalance power by taking some power in politics away from vested interests and fossil fuels, and actually strengthen the balance towards organizations that campaign for more ambitious climate action. And important point is that without engagement of civil society organizations, it's very difficult for climate assemblies to realize their full potential. And that is, again, as Graham mentioned, a key weakness that we see why climate assemblies that we have observed so far, some of them perhaps didn't really deliver on the full potential of the political and social impacts that they could have achieved in terms of advancing climate policies. And finally, being public service institutions, it's actually arguably a duty, social duty for civil society organizations to ensure that input from citizens is properly considered in the policymaking. And how can NGOs engage with climate assemblies? Well, there are a variety of roles. They can be proponent and advocate for the assembly to take place. And we're seeing, for example, Extinction Rebellion in Scotland and some other countries has been actually one of the key players that pushed for a climate assembly to take place. They could provide evidence to the assembly by sitting on the expert advisory body and coming to testify, also through stakeholder bodies. They could serve and provide input to the design of the assembly. Importantly, they can be a communicator and amplifier of the messages around assemblies, lifting the importance of the process, but also pushing for the proper follow-up. They can also be a watchdog to ensure that the assembly is the process of the assembly is a quality one and is legitimate, and they can push for strong follow-up to the citizens' recommendations. So that brings me to the 8-step approach that the Playbook has developed and proposes for the civil society organizations to consider. And they are divided into 3 stages. So 3 of those steps take place before the assembly starts. And I have to say, when we were writing the playbook, it became very apparent that actually the bulk of work, the bulk of thinking actually happens at that stage before the assembly even starts. And you will see in the playbook quite a lot of material actually sits in that first phase. And then during the assembly and after. So let's talk about what happens before the assembly. So first of all, step number 1 is for the civil society organization actually to understand the opportunity, why to engage with climate assembly, and how it can help advance the objectives of the organization. And an essential step in that is actually to debunk some misconceptions about climate assemblies. If you were part of the previous discussion we had last year on that, we devoted quite a lot of attention on that. But here are some of the key misconceptions in terms of assuming that citizens are incapable of contributing to such a complex debate as climate change. that climate assembly might undermine the existing channels of policymaking, such as parliament or the government, and take decision-making far from them, and that they could lower ambition and slow down the pace of climate action. Well, we discuss it in more detail in the document, but current practice suggests that actually none of these three statements are true. You can see some quotes on the slide from Citizens Assembly expert, which talks about the greatest misconception is underestimating people, and also a quote from the Member of Parliament in the UK stating that citizens were actually much more prepared to go further and faster than the government was expecting. So Citizens Assembly can actually help advance ambitions, and citizens are very capable when provided opportunity to learn and to deliberate, to come with creative and ambitious recommendations on climate action. Secondly, CSOs need to define strategic objectives and consider how an assembly can help an organization reach its own strategic goals in terms of either pushing for a more advanced or faster pace of climate action, or delivering a quality policy design. Secondly, CSOs should consider how they can help ensure that the assembly is most impactful in driving that ambitious, but also just and effective climate action. And that's a very important element, because I think all of us now realize that just transition and equity has to be an integral part of any solution that we design to address climate crisis. Without that criteria, we will not succeed. And climate assembly, by the way that it's composed, representing kind of the average makeup of the society, but also through this process that actually allows every voice to be heard and every concern to be balanced and put on the table, is a great tool for the discussions where justice and equity and some very difficult choices are at the core. And thirdly, by engaging with climate assemblies and integrating them into their strategies, CSOs can help promote more robust and democratic engagement in climate governance. And that is another point in designing the strategy. And then, of course, we discuss in the playbook, you can see on the right-hand side, what are the kinds of issues where climate assemblies could be most impactful. And that's where CEOs, which are usually very engaged with the political debate, oftentimes much more so than the democracy-focused institutions that often push or are involved in climate assemblies, they can be really very valuable in helping the organizers of the climate assembly to determine what are the key issues or policy dilemmas where the input of the assembly would really be very useful and effective. And in the playbook, we discuss examples of past climate assemblies and how they impacted policies, what types of issues they have focused on in terms of targets, strategic decisions, guiding principles for policies, and also concrete proposals for policy measures. We also talk about examples in terms of intent of the assembly to give overarching direction setting agenda, or to focus on specific policies, or perhaps to rather evaluate different options and get input from citizens which of those options are preferred. And there are different examples from the actual assemblies that have taken place. Of course, once the organization has gone through those steps, step number 3 is actually to consider specific pathways to impact. How CSOs can engage and ensure that the assembly has impact and delivers to maximum at its potential. And here there are different ways to do that. As I mentioned, providing input to the commissioning authorities on the desired objectives, most useful questions and remit, and focus for recommendations, communicate and integrate assembly into the communication strategy, and also consider the importance of follow-up process. Respond to call for inputs from the commissioning authority on the design, and many organizations already doing that. For example, in Spain, civil society, and I saw Maria Deliberativa, I think today is on the call with us, so maybe they want to share in the discussion as well. But basically, there was a process call for input, and many institutions have responded to it, but so was the case in other countries. And finally, once push for the credible design and also clarity on the envisioned follow-up, and do so upfront. We also discussed in the document that when developing pathways for impact, it's important for CSOs to consider the risks around climate assemblies and how they can mitigate them. And a lot of those risks are actually, as you can see on the right-hand side, are related to preventing poor follow-up. So that's where CSOs can actually make an impact by pushing for political engagement and follow-up on the assemblies. And then we discuss specific impacts of climate policies, past climate assemblies, on policies, on stakeholders, also on public debate and on participants. I won't go into details now, but we can talk more about it in the discussion if anyone is willing. And I'm sure Oisín will talk more about the Irish case in terms of specific impacts. Now, once the assembly starts, CSOs have an essential role to play, as I mentioned, both in terms of providing expert input into the assembly. And here it's very important to be aware of being neutral and balanced, so that the assembly is not labeled as being run by Greens, which will diminish its legitimacy, but also provide input in very simple and easy to understand terms. And very importantly, which is step 5, they should also advocate for the assembly while it's taking place, integrating it into its communications. An important point that we discuss in Playbook, which is very relevant for this particular step, is how civil society can balance its very important critical role as a watchdog, as a critique, and a watchdog for credibility of the process, and also its role as an advocate for the assembly and for its recommendations. And why I'm raising that is because that challenge came in many countries that we have considered. We also discussed it last time we met a year ago to talk about the subject. How do you criticize the process when you feel you need to do so and still leave yourself space to rally behind recommendations, for example, of the assembly, not to discredit the whole process? And we discussed some ideas around that and examples. And the main advice here, of course, is to focus your critique on a specific element rather than criticizing and rejecting the process outright. Be constructive and also consider what is the most appropriate channel for that critique. But again, we can talk more about that when we go into the discussion. And that brings me to the final stage, which is CSO engagement after the process, which is critically holding politicians accountable and utilizing recommendations and political campaigns of CSOs. And here we talk about how for example, recommendations of the assemblies and voices of the members of climate assemblies, they're a hugely powerful resource for CSO organizations because they are fresh voices. They are the best advocates, really, for ambitious climate action. And many of them, after the assembly is finished, have formed member associations and are very willing to engage in media opportunities. And therefore, CSOs should think about how they can support and capitalize on the former assembly members. And importantly, not to miss the opportunity, many institutions we've interviewed for this project would mention that because they didn't really have a strategy of engaging with the assemblies, they kind of watched it from the sidelines, and when the recommendations came out, weren't prepared to integrate that into their campaigns, and later on realized that this was a missed opportunity. So that's something to highlight. And one step, which is step 8, is actually the one that starts very much at the beginning of the process, even before the assembly is taking place. And goes all the way through the end until after the recommendations are published. It's strategic communications. And the key message here is that civil society organizations should really integrate the assembly kind of the process of planning one, the process when the assembly takes place, and then the follow-up into their strategic communications. And of course, the focus will shift in kind of before the assembly. You probably want to talk about making the case for the assembly and the potential that it can bring. Why should it be held? When the assembly is already taking place, it can be a very powerful information point to actually communicate about your issues. But because this is something exciting that is happening, that is a kind of like a hook for media and politicians to pay attention to what you have to say. So that's what civil society organizations can use in their media campaigns, on social media, and really in any kind of speaking or political campaigning opportunities. And of course, once the recommendations are out, that is quite an obvious step to assess which recommendations are in line with your strategy as a civil society organization, and integrate those recommendations into the political campaign. And that could be a really powerful tool for CSOs. So I'm concluding with that. I'm just slightly over 15 minutes, but here are some thoughts, I think, based on what we've just discussed. Citizens can be among the most powerful allies, really, for civil society, for pushing for ambitious and effective climate response. And I say they're not really being used at the moment. This opportunity is not being used to the fullest impact. And recommendations from Climate Assembly is a politically powerful argument for advocacy. But for that to work, we really need civil society to come to the plate to step up and to contribute in a major way. And I hope that this playbook will be one step in that process. Another one, I think some of you who might be part of the European Climate Governance Hub might know that there is now a new group being formed, which is an alliance of democracy and climate NGOs who will work together on the issues around public participation. But of course, we can do much more. So I'll finish with that, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Alina. That was really great. I have lots of thoughts and questions, but I'd like to bring Oisín into the conversation if possible. Welcome. Oisín, you're as I mentioned, you're the chief executive of Friends of the Earth Ireland, and you're in a very unusual position because being based in Ireland means that you've got issues off, have you? Being based in Ireland means that you've actually experienced at least 2 assemblies that have been really relevant to the work of Friends of the Earth. So the original Citizens Assembly 2016 to 2018, which looked at climate change, and I think a lot of people forget it looked at climate change because it's so famous for dealing with abortion. And then more recently, the Biodiversity Assembly last year. And I guess, I'm interested to get your just general responses to what Alina said, but I'm kind of interested to start off by thinking, how has the positioning of Friends? Oh, don't bring Alina back in. She's got something to say. Don't make her disappear. She can join. What does the how has Friends of the Earth positioning changed towards assemblies, given that you have had this experience of one earlier and one more recently? So how has your sort of strategy changed towards assemblies, or has it changed?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I guess to be full disclosure, we were much less active on the Biodiversity Assembly than we were on the Climate Assembly, just by the nature of the focus of our work. Although we did lend our experience to those who are more focused, like the likes of Birdwatch, which is the BirdLife International member in Ireland. Those who were very focused on the Biodiversity Assembly, we shared our experience of the Climate Assembly with them as it was happening. It also operated in a slightly different way. But I mean, first of all, I'd like to say thank you so much to Alina, because I think this is a really good service she's done civil society and academia in doing this. But I think the document is a really useful type of document in that, CSOs are all, including, I like to think that we lift our eyes to the horizon a bit, but we're often stuck in not so much in the rut, but in the immediate focus of our campaigning and the next deadline, the next election, the next decision point. And we hopefully are part of European networks at times and part of European hubs to learn from others. But the taking of so much practitioner experience and then the application of academic rigor to it and it's presenting back in a way that is a playbook as opposed to simply a journal article is so useful. And it's a really great model. I hope that for funders and academia and civil society together to look to again. But anyway, so thank you so much, Alina. I hope this will be useful to many people who are thinking about this. Albeit that my general thoughts about citizens' assemblies mean that they're not automatically, the success of one in one country at one time is not automatically replicable somewhere else. There's a number of conditions, environmental conditions, so to say, that are important. And I might say a bit about that before I talk specifically about the Irish. Well, this is the Irish experience, but the Irish Assembly in particular, and that is that basically they're not going to work. They probably won't even be set up, but they're not going to work if the government is dead set against climate action in the first place. Like certainly in the Irish experience, going back to the Assembly on marriage, access to marriage, and then the access to abortion, which was the same citizens' assembly as the climate one, they were set up because the government knew it had to do something. So there was already like a favourable inclination. Now, climate was put in almost as an afterthought in that abortion referendum, and to that extent, it wasn't as true that the government was committed to doing something. But then you obviously, and Alina's mentioned this, you need good chair, good secretariat, and a good selection of experts. We were lucky we didn't have to fight for that too much, but again, you can't take it as a given. Obviously, you need an active civil society. I'll come back to that. But the key thing then also is you need a political process after the Assembly to translate those recommendations into policy. It doesn't happen automatically, even if the Assembly and the politicians, even if the Assembly is good and the politicians are up for it. And certainly in the Irish case, the Assembly effectively in the end had detailed recommendations, but ultimately their impact was more as a mandate than a prescription. They demonstrated to the politicians that there was more appetite for climate action than they thought, as had been the case on marriage equality and on abortion, and the direction of travel. But actually, if you look at what ultimately was in the Climate Act in 2021 and the associated policies, some of them were mentioned in the Assembly, but it wasn't a direct translation. And that political process that was just as important was this all-party special parliamentary committee with resources of the researchers for each political grouping that actually did another 6 or 8 months worth of work, almost a year actually, on the Assembly's recommendations before they became sort of a report from a parliamentary committee. And then, even then, it's not automatic they get translated into government action, which of course is one of the key roles for civil society. Like there's lots of citizens' assembly recommendations that don't get taken up, and indeed even the climate, and certainly in Ireland, and I'm sure elsewhere. In the Irish case, like the actual motion from the Parliament that set up the Assembly said that the recommendations on abortion would have to go to a special committee before being considered by the Parliament and the government. It didn't actually say that around the climate ones. We had to lobby for it to be treated with parity of esteem and given the same treatment, which we succeeded in doing. But then the last thing, and I guess this is like basically to remind ourselves, we need to always be doing the conjunctural analysis, the situational analysis as to what's going to work, because I'm looking back, it's really clear that the Citizens' Assembly itself was one of the key interventions in Irish climate policy in the last 10, if even 20 years, along with the kind of the IPCC reports, the COPs, going back, the Al Gore movies, the Stern report, but it was certainly one of the most impactful interventions. But when the report from the committee was being finalised, it coincided with, in March 2019, with the first big climate strike, youth climate strike. And there's no doubt but that the political ambition in the report itself, and definitely the receptiveness of government to that report, was part of that broader context. And look, we see 5 years on that it's a very different context. It was the run-up to the European elections then, and we might talk more about that. I think politicians are over-interpreting the noise now and missing the underlying signal. But that's maybe a different debate. But how a citizens' assembly recommendations or parliamentary committees report on a citizens' assembly recommendations land in the political system, it's not a linear, purely deliberative process. It's not immune from the politics and the noise and the media debate and whatever else is going on. So we were very lucky in a sense that it landed at that moment, and it made it much easier for us to push politicians, because ultimately, and Alina said this, but we would say it too, and ultimately, there's no guarantee it gets taken into policy, and that's obviously where civil society organizations come in. And like at the end of the day, I have a very simple approach to campaigning. You get politicians to promise something, or they promise something because of some set of circumstances, whether it's in a manifesto or in a program for government. or in Parliament. You get them to promise something, and then you hammer away at them to try to get them to deliver, and you hold them to account and use immediate opportunities to try to get them to deliver. And a Citizens' Assembly report and a government saying they want to respect the voices of citizens, and then a parliamentary committee endorsing that is a pretty powerful. Like it's probably almost as powerful as a programme for government commitment. We have coalition governments; they all have programmes for government. It's probably, you know, debatable which of those is more powerful, but they're definitely together, you know, compared to a manifesto promise or a random speech, the two most powerful mandates for the government having to actually deliver something. I would say just very briefly on some of the process along the way here. Interesting, there's a lot of variation even between the two assemblies you mentioned, and indeed going back to the abortion one. In the climate one, the Secretariat and the chair decided not to actually ask any of the stakeholders, including ourselves, to present. We were able to watch. We had engaged beforehand, and I would say, and as you said, Alina, like if you were going to engage a civil society, engage early. We saw ourselves kind of as an accompanier and an encourager rather than a lobbyist. Like we wanted to present ourselves that way. So we were saying, you know, here's some experts you could be asking, but they weren't us. They were, you know, independent experts. Because we found this in other deliberative forums too. Of course, if climate change gets discussed in what's supposed to be an expert deliberative basis, of course the pro-action side comes out on top because the evidence is so clear-cut. Whereas when it's only being debated in a media forum or a parliamentary forum or a political forum where there's no necessary extra weight given to evidence or deliberation, then climate goes down. So like we were happy enough to stand back from it and not insist on being asked to present, because on the same basis they didn't ask the Congress of Trade Unions, or more to the point, the farming organizations or the business organizations to present. So citizens got experts and they got some voices of real experience, including farmers, but they didn't get the lobby groups. So that was a surprise to us, but actually we went along with it. We decided to, based on what had happened with the abortion and the marriage ones, we decided to go all in early and be, which is a gamble. We didn't know what the results would be, and to be the kind of cheerleader for the Assembly, both in private and in public. And I think that meant, you know, the Secretariat was well disposed to us, and obviously put us in a good position, because we had been saying nice things about the Assembly before they reported. When we then said the government must listen to the recommendations of the Assembly, we had a lot of credibility. We didn't just say that when we happened to like them, the recommendations. We'd been saying it from the beginning. But of course, like, you know, again, to say finally, we don't, you know, you can't be sure the same process now would lead to the same outcomes. Like, you know, the influence of the trolls and the weaponization and the rise of the far right, it's not so sure that 100 representative citizens would necessarily would feel they have the freedom to be as evidence-based as now as they were 5 years ago. You mentioned, actually I was interested in this didn't happen in Ireland, that the Assembly members formed, I mean, some of them got active elsewhere afterwards, but they didn't form any sort of association. And actually they remained relatively private citizens, a bit like a jury. They didn't actually become public figures. You'd worry now that they'd be afraid, you know, some of them would, because there was televised, they could be identified. Some of them might be worried to become members of a Citizens' Assembly on climate, but given how it's not as bad here in Ireland as elsewhere, but how polarized it can become. So again, I don't want to rain on the parade, but it's possible that we have, for the moment, seen the high watermark of the impact that Citizens' Assemblies can have. Like, I wouldn't say they're necessarily definitely the answer to polarization. They can help, but I mean, it depends on the balance of forces, and the balance of forces right now, like, depend, I think, more on your regulation of tech companies and on real leadership from politicians holding their nerve in the face of very vocal, still minority interests. Because again, the underlying signals of public opinion in Ireland, at least, are stronger than they were 5 years ago, but the noise is different, and politicians have real problems distinguishing the signal from the noise.
Such interesting, but I mean, the assemblies that are happening now, I think, are still showing that the kind of recommendations that you might hope for from a CSO position are still coming out. It's really interesting that the design of assemblies allows them to be spaces in which polarization doesn't, you know, it is not fostered. Sure. But that doesn't mean that there isn't more polarization outside. I completely agree with that.
And even one last sentence, even the Biodiversity Assembly, it did well. You're right. So like that is another data point in favor of them being able to withstand pressures. But its recommendations came out before, I think, the height of the controversy over the nature restoration law. So if they've been coming out during the time that Manfred Weber was sort of pretending it was the end of farming, and the BBB had been successful in the Netherlands, it might have been different, and it hasn't had the same impact because it came at a different time in terms of the political cycle. One other thing is, of course, when things like when a Citizens' Assembly report lands in the, usually in Ireland's case, 5-year political cycle, also matters. Like, it came just before the European and general elections last time, but like it influenced the future government. I mean, so whereas if it comes halfway through, or like the 4th year of a government where they're kind of on the downward trend and they don't feel they have as much space to make decisions, it might not be as impactful. I don't know. It depends.
No, so Oisín and Alina, jump in at any point. But Oisín, you kind of said you weren't so involved with the biodiversity one, but you did have a word in the ear with some of those organisations that were involved in it, like BirdLife. What kind were the kind of things you were saying similar to the sort of points that Alina was making, or were you making very sort of island-specific points? I mean, were you trying
to? No, they were.
You were saying, I liked your point about go in early and stay engaged. Basically,
yes, we absolutely recommend that, and they did get in early. I think they felt not as close to the process once it got going as they might have liked. There wasn't as much space given to NGO. There were stakeholders at that assembly. There wasn't as much space given to NGOs as there was given to other stakeholders for some reason. But again, the results were strong. I mean, I think they did have real concerns that, one of the things that some civil society organizations have, that it would actually delay things, because there had been, like, not the assembly itself, but then it was designated that it would go to a parliamentary committee again. And yet, first of all, there was a question of which parliamentary committee it would go to, because it was less clear-cut than in climate. But also, the main parliamentary committee on climate and environment had done lots of hearings on biodiversity the previous year, because they kind of they were in their full flow, and they'd just done it themselves. And there was kind of a discussion about, really, do we have to do that all over again? Do we have to relitigate this, basically, just to have the usual process around a citizen assembly? Now, that did happen. In fact, really, the knock-on impact of that was that it went back to the climate committee, and they did it well, but actually it meant they had less time to do the things that they're mandated to do under the climate law that came out from the previous assembly, because there's only so many hours in the day for politicians. So they didn't do their oversight of the climate action plan last year as well as they should have, because they were too busy doing the findings from the Citizens' Assembly on biodiversity. And the other issue was, it wasn't clear because of the way that government departments have split responsibility for environment in Ireland, it wasn't clear which committee it could have been. It might have actually been the committee responsible for housing, who are all, these are just by way of contingencies to be aware of. There was lobbying for it to be given to the Agriculture Committee, which of course we wouldn't have wanted. But we were worried that if it went to the Climate Committee, they would be seen by agricultural interests not to be independent either. So there was, like, that level of contestation, I guess, and it didn't get given its own special committee. Like, on an all-party basis, it went to one of the regular departmental shadow committees, and didn't get any extra resources. So there was, like, I don't know if we're necessarily seeing a diminishing law of returns, but certainly the specific circumstances around the Biodiversity Assembly were still positive, but it wasn't as impactful as the climate.
There's a couple of things there. One is that maybe you might actually have got to a point where there's too many recommendations from citizens' assemblies in the Irish system. It's really, we've seen this actually in Belgium, in East Belgium, where they have a permanent assembly, that the administration is having trouble keeping up with, because each year there's new recommendations, and it's a really interesting thing that none of us had really thought about the capacity.
So not quite all, but many civil society groups, and indeed many kind of government politicians, are saying, let's just give this problem to a citizens' assembly, so that any hot potato or anything they're not sure how to handle, because they've been successful in a number of really big things, they're creating more and more of them, and that does just kind of basically overwhelm the system, both the citizens' assembly system, the media ecosystem, and indeed the government and parliamentary reception system just can't cope with all the recommendations.
No, it's really interesting. And just before I hand over to Alina, we've actually got a quote in the if I remember rightly, Alina, haven't we, from someone about the biodiversity one, where they said they thought this was going to be a waste of time. They thought it was the government trying to stop things happening, but actually now it's happened. They've realised it's completely changed the discourse on nature and biodiversity. That's kind of really interesting about sort of a skeptic on that. Alina, you wanted to jump in.
Yes, fascinating discussion. Really, lots of very interesting points. But I just wanted to pick up on what Oisín said about what you said about that maybe some citizens would be afraid now, and this some participants would be afraid to be active, to speak up, given what is happening right now. And I just wanted to come to the point, highlight the point that we actually make in the playbook. In some countries, civil society organizations have lobbied and criticized climate assemblies for unwillingness of the commissioners to fully open up the process to the whole population. And I think that's a very important point. There is a reason for why it's done, to protect the privacy of the members, and I think that's very important. And I'm highlighting that because I see from the chat there are quite a few people here today who actually are planning to organize or participate in the process that is to be held soon. So I think that was quite an unfair, perhaps, critique in certain cases, because citizens' assemblies are not actually designed to involve the whole population in the process itself by means of open deliberation. There are other ways to engage broader population, and some assemblies invite submissions. There are stakeholder groups and so on. So I just want to highlight that this is an important design point that I think civil society organizations should be aware of, and we caution in the playbook against making unrealistic demands on the commissioners. So back to you, Graham.
No, that's great. I'm sorry, I'm just answering a question in the chat. So, I'm kind of interested. This is a point, actually, interestingly, it was a point that Mark just raised, although he's raised it slightly differently. But Mark, do you want to come in and just raise the question you were going to, you've put in the chat? So, sorry, this is an opportunity for anybody really also to raise questions. So Mark, do you want to say?
Yeah, I'll just add myself to the spotlight here. I actually posted it only to you, Graham, so everyone else can't see it, but I can.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Because I thought you could steal my question.
No. I think you should ask him, because I think I don't want to take responsibility for your poorly contrived question.
Here goes, Oisín. I'm curious to see what you think. So basically, I think I'm curious whether you think CSOs more broadly have a responsibility towards advocating for climate assemblies, because in a way, if not, then there is this open question for me: is it because maybe you don't consider climate assemblies to be truly legitimate? But if yes, then I'm guessing why don't we see more CSOs step in and make the opportunity, or use the opportunity? So I'm wondering if you have any reflections based on that.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think on the first question, whether CSOs have a duty to advocate for them, I don't think I'd go that far. I think if you're well, it depends, I guess, on the nature of your CSO. But if you are a campaigning organization like Friends of the Earth is, I think it's just a matter of judgment as to what you think the best strategy is to achieve certain policy changes, or certain, usually policy changes that you're seeking to get. And you're like, I would recommend that analysis of what you think is going to be most likely to build the pressure and the opportunity, or the evidence base and the pressure and the scrutiny, the media attention that normally some combination of which is required to press the government to act. I would certainly say CSOs should consider a demand around a citizens' assembly, but I think it will depend on the particular context of the country, like whether or not you think the government might be, like, if a government's elected and already feels it has a mandate to do strong climate action, it may not need a citizens' assembly, although there could be a case for doing it to broaden the legitimacy of the policies if they are controversial, which many climate policies can be. But equally, if the government is kind of very illiberal, would you be sure that a citizens' assembly would be run fairly and it could be used to try to rubber stamp negative climate policy? So I think if you're a campaigning NGO, whether or not you campaign for a citizens' assembly, I think is a judgment call based on your campaigning strategy. If there is one being set up by government, and the government is relatively liberal democratic government that won't be itself trying to entirely skew the process, but then I would definitely be advocating to CSOs to engage early and to engage actively in all the ways that Alina described. I think that gives them the best chance of gives the assembly the best chance of success and the best chance of making a positive contribution, for sure.
Okay. Any other questions out there at all? I saw some. Kathy Con had something in there, but I know her image isn't there. I'll ask her a question for you. She was actually asking about the Children and Young People's Biodiversity Assembly and whether or not Friends of the Earth engage with that. I guess the answer is probably no, because you weren't involved in the biodiversity. But I'm kind of interested about what the resonance was to the community of actually seeing children and young people do this work. Did you? Was it something that actually resonated or not?
That was a very positive dimension to the Citizens Assembly on biodiversity.
Sorry, for people who don't know, sorry, I should just say, so it was an adult assembly and a sort of normal citizens assembly that was running on biodiversity loss. And at the same time, one of the ministers established a Children and Young People's Assembly that ran at the same time for a couple of weekends and fed its proposals into the main assembly, and then was also considered by the parliamentary committee. Sorry, Oisín, I thought I should let people understand.
To the best of my understanding, it was run by, while the adult assembly was run by civil servants and others coordinated or delegated from the department of the Prime Minister, the Prime Minister's office. The Children's Assembly, I think, was like outsourced is a pejorative term in some ways, but was run by university, by Dublin City University, as a sort of a project on behalf. I presume they were paid by the minister, by some other department, to do it. I think it was very positive. I guess it was partly in a way inspired by the climate experience, the more general climate experience, but by the role that the youth climate strikers had in the 2019-2020 period, and sort of that brought attention to how important these issues are for the younger generation, and indeed what an articulate and insightful voice they can have on them. That because I don't think it was actually that there was that many activists on biodiversity already around among young people. I think it was more that the minister, having, and it was a Green Party minister, having experienced the positive impact of the climate strikes, which I've said earlier that the Citizens Assembly was one of the biggest impactful things. I think the climate strikes were probably the most impactful intervention on Irish climate policy discourse and policy making in the last 10 years. So I think inspired by that, the minister said, well, let's try and almost, not institutionalize is the wrong word, but let's encourage a youth input on biodiversity. And I think it did resonate. Now, and I think it contributed to the process well. I don't think there was quite the same media attention on the Biodiversity Assembly, although there was a high-profile chair as there was on the climate one. But there was attention, and the youth assembly was definitely part of that.
Okay, Sergey, you stuck a question in. Do you want to just jump in and ask it yourself, rather? I mean, everyone gets bored with me interpreting everybody. So, can we just highlight Sergey?
Thanks to the panel also for your insights. I wonder what your thoughts are on using the citizens' assemblies as a sort of a tool in building political power by the civil society. In a way, when a citizens' assembly takes place and produces the recommendations, we as civil society, in certain circumstances, try to use that to influence the government. But what if it's also a way for us to generate also kind of a platform for candidates or parties to run on, so that the right people end up in the positions of power to implement those recommendations that are legitimate because they are coming from the public? Thank you.
Thanks, Sergey. Did you have any thoughts on that, either?
Want to go in, Alina?
Or Eugene? Sorry, I haven't got very good connection. I might have lost me for a second then. Ooh. Hello? Can you still? Sorry, I'm having some connection problems. Can you still hear me? Okay.
You're going through. You did glitch for a second, but we hear you clearly.
Okay, that's great. So I just wondered if you had any response to that, Alina or Oisín, about sort of how this can actually, how assemblies might build political power for electoral politics at all. I have an example which I'll pull out in a second, but I'm just kind of interested.
Well, the only thing I could say, I think theoretically, I think you would expect that civil society would absolutely use that. And I think if we think about the UK election, there has been quite a lot of push by civil society for all major parties to include climate issues into their manifestos. And interestingly, a few months ago, we actually saw a representative of Labour Party kind of mention that Labour government, if they were elected, would actually consider citizens' assemblies as one way of engaging with public. So we're seeing some examples of that happening, but arguably, I think, and that's what I think we were discussing, I don't see yet civil society using it in a major way. In those arguments, I think much more can be done there, but yeah, I'm interested to hear what others think.
I think that's a really interesting question, and it's not one that I had thought about, because in a way, so on the climate side, the all-party consensus was reached before the last election, as in the citizens, they finished their work their main work in March 2019, and the election was in February 2020. So there was an all-party consensus on the main issues. Obviously, we were looking for that to be reflected in party manifestos, but we weren't specifically. We were kind of referencing the all-party report rather than the Citizen Assembly per se at that point. But interestingly now, like we have an election in Ireland somewhere before next March, and the main environmental network of NGOs is in the middle of doing its manifesto demands in the next few weeks. And I must ask those who are when I go into those discussions at the plenary, and when we're discussing the ones around biodiversity, I must ask those who are more active, are they using the Citizens' Assembly as a reference? Because it does seem to be an obvious thing that for us to do, particularly if there's policies there that haven't been implemented by this government. You can say they have the legitimacy of the Assembly, and equally inside parties, you could imagine that they would say, well, if we choose this policy option to be in our manifesto, again, we can say it has the legitimacy of a Citizens' Assembly imprimatur. But whether the parties are thinking that way, I don't know, and I don't even know if the NGOs are thinking that way. But actually, it's a question I'm going to ask now that you've raised it.
So Sergey, if something happens in Ireland, it's your fault, okay? If something, I think the 2 or 3 examples. I mean, they're sort of not quite exactly where Sergey was speaking, but one is we've seen actually a number of Assembly members after assemblies, both at national level and local level, stand for local election. So it's not based on using the Assembly as its kind of platform, as their platform, but that actually the experience of doing it, bringing that, and of course they then bring that into their role, and that always strikes me as really quite phenomenal. And it's there's a small number of those, both parish councils and local councils, where people have come from national or local assemblies and moved into that. The second one as well, which I think is really interesting, is the example of the German Climate Assembly, which was organized by civil society just before the election in order to try and affect the platforms of the parties, and then the coalition agreement afterwards. So that was explicitly established to try and shape political discourse, and it was a pretty impressive example. 2 things are not in its favor. The first was that the Ukraine war happened, and then everybody's attention went somewhere else. So they'd managed to get climate up the agenda. The second was that, and this is actually something which I suppose has a resonance with what Alina was saying, which is they ran the Assembly and hadn't really thought that much about what the impact strategy looks like afterwards. And I think this is generally a thought. I think a lot of CSOs get very focused on what's happening in the Assembly, and not enough strategizing about what's going to happen after the Assembly. And it's really interesting that most of what Oisín was talking about was how they prepare themselves for working after the Assembly and actually using their influence. That was just a couple of things. And then the third one, which brings me, this is me trying to neatly sew in things together, I guess, is things like the People's Plan for Nature. And I know that the WWF, who in the UK, People's Plan for Nature was organised by the worldwide WWF. It was RSPB, the Birds Charity, and also National Trust. And WWF have been using the kind of thing that you were talking about. This is what citizens think as they talk to as they talk to politicians, of actually saying, this isn't just us. This, you know, you're used to us, but this is actually, so I think Oisín's right, and you know, Sergej's point is right, I think, here, which is this can actually give a lot more legitimacy to positions than just a CSO saying, well, we think this. And I think it's, and I think one of the things Alina's shown us in the playbook is that's an under, it's something that CSOs haven't always recognized, that the power of that, this isn't us, this is a citizens' assembly. Anyway, I mentioned the People's Plan for Nature. There's a question here which actually asks, which mentions this. So this is my neat segue. So Sophie, who's from Norway, who I actually was in a meeting with this morning. So Sophie, I think you've probably spent way too much time with me and with Knoca today, but do you want to ask your question? Can you highlight Sophie?
It's been nice seeing you all day today, Graham. We've had a lot of quality time.
The
check, as we say in English, the check is in the post. The money is in the post. Thank you very much.
So hi, everyone. Thanks for a wonderful conversation so far. I'm Sophie, and this is Mette from So Central. And we're the third-party secretariat for 2 national citizen assemblies that will be starting this fall. And as I mentioned briefly in the chat, one is commissioned by the government and one is commissioned by 6 civil society organizations. And I'm mainly working on the civil society-based one, which is also kind of the background for our question. So just very briefly, the civil society citizen assembly has a theme based on our growing national wealth that is based on oil and gas, and what we as a country should do with this growing wealth in terms of global crisis and wars and etc. And one of the aims of this citizen panel is also to raise or bring up the conversation that we as a country have not had yet, and not necessarily only like what are the recommendations, but also just having this conversation. And we know that People's Plan for Nature did a really good job on mobilizing people outside of the panel as well. So we're just curious on, are there any other good examples on mobilizing people? Because that's going to be huge for this panel. And also maybe if you have some thoughts on the fact that we also are commissioned by civil society. So there's a balance there between the commissioning civil society and the civil society around and outside the panel. And I completely broke the rule of asking just one question. Sorry, guys.
No, it's a really interesting question for you.
No, that's fine.
Sorry, I just jumped in there. Did you want, was there another point? Sorry.
No, I just added that we are 2 here, so that's fine.
Oisín, I'm kind of interested. You talked a little bit about the sort of work that you did in, if you like, the sort of classic political influencing and political persuasion work that you were doing around the Climate Assembly with the politicians, etc. Have you experienced either with the Climate Assembly or watching around the Biodiversity Assembly, or in fact with any of the other assemblies, because you've had so many, you know, you've actually now 6 or 7 assemblies in Ireland. Have you experience of civil society organizations using this as a sort of amplifying the debate and actually using this as a way of opening up public discourse at all, or is that not really the experience?
No, for sure. I mean, on the climate one, we did a lot of, I guess, both. Well, I think I would describe it as mobilizing and amplifying. So, for example, there was a public participation done by the Assembly Secretariat on behalf, as part of the process, and we encouraged people to put in submissions. But we were very clear, like if I remember correctly, we avoided doing like an electronic e-action where everyone was saying the same thing, because we knew that would probably be unfair on the poor citizens who have to read them, compared to when you do it to politicians. There's a diminishing law of returns now, but you do it to politicians to prove that there's people who care about these things. But given the nature of the Citizens' Assembly debate, we were encouraging people to like write more personal letters and more personal testimony or more personal proposals, rather than just click on a template that we had written. And then we did a participative photo stunt, I suppose you'd call it, near. We were very careful. We did had to give this some thought at the time. The Assembly, the first weekend, the Assembly was meeting. We didn't want to appear like we were trying to protest, or sorry, not protest, but like demonstrate our pressure, the actual Assembly or the actual members, but we wanted to be part of the, making the media pay attention to it. So we were kind of down the road. It was being held in a seaside town just north of Dublin. We were down the road in a green area doing like a kind of a, I think there was even dancing involved. There was some sort of like creative photo opportunity to draw the media, and then kind of a wish tree where people had written what they hoped the Assembly might achieve, and were hanging all their wishes on a tree. I think we had some exercises where that was being done in other venues beforehand, and they were all being brought there. So there was an attempt to, like, it was to use that phrase I used earlier, kind of, we were cheerleading as opposed to demonstrating or protesting or mobilizing at the Assembly. We were very clear we weren't mobilizing at them. We were mobilizing for them or around them. But yes, we did try that. We did try to do that as part of the being the champions for them. On the issue of being the civil society actually commissioning it, that's really interesting, and that's not something that's happened here yet. And it's interesting, obviously, there were sort of, third-party experts, as in people involved who are experts at facilitation and so on, in the state-led ones here in Ireland. But like the Climate Assembly had a judge as a judge from a court as the chairperson, and the biodiversity one had an academic who was also known for having won a very strange competition we have in Ireland called the Rose of Tralee. She was a theoretical physicist, a mathematician, and a lecturer, but also very into the environment. She was like a celebrity and also very competent chair of the second one. And then there was a professional secretariat beneath that. There was mostly civil servants on secondment, but I think they did hire in some specialist facilitators and so on. But I think, interestingly, to see a third-party provider being commissioned for two different assemblies by the government and by the civil society for different, that's really interesting. The fact that government's also commissioning, I think, helps, because otherwise I think there'd be a risk that those who think it's all a conspiracy, or not, maybe that's not even going that far, but who think like, we had people, because it was one of the controversial issues is around, in both in biodiversity and climate, is around agriculture and farming and so on. The fact that there wasn't somebody from every county in Ireland was being leveled as a criticism, because therefore it wasn't representative. Of course, it was demographically representative, not precisely representative. So when it's the state running it, well, this is maybe it's my bias, is you could argue that has greater legitimacy than if it's being commissioned by civil society through a third party, effectively, I don't know, maybe you might not, I'm not sure whether you're commercial or not, but a third party provider. I think there's a higher hurdle of trust building to pass in that case. But I think it helps that the state's also commissioning you at the same time. That levels the playing field.
Actually, I think you misunderstood. There's one being run by the state, which is on one thing, and then the civil society is being run on another topic. And the civil society one is being run on a topic that the campaigners, which are mostly humanitarian organizations, don't think is being discussed by government. So they're using it as a way of opening up.
I got that there was two different topics, but was the same provider not involved in helping run each of them? Maybe not.
Yes. They're the delivery organization in both ones, but they're not the commissioning organization.
No, great. No, I got that, but I think that helps, because otherwise I think it helps that the state is also commissioning the same provider.
Yes.
In terms of that, it looks more like, as in that provider therefore has trust and transparency, credibility, than if civil society, if only civil society was commissioning to do something and the state wasn't, albeit that the topics are different.
No, I think that our friends at So Central are very aware of the optics and what they need. They're very, very concerned about that and very interested about how to deal with that. Alina, were you going to? I think there are some examples in the playbook around Austria and around Spain in terms of the way that the way that civil society opened up these debates.
Yes, so when we were working at the playbook, we've discussed with different countries, and certainly one message which came very clear: it hasn't been very easy so far to mobilize civil society to come up with a coherent response And it also depends a little bit on the level of awareness in each particular country that existed prior to the Climate Assembly about this as an instrument. But one example is Spain. I think earlier on there was a colleague on the call from Maria Deliberativa. They work at the grassroots level, mobilizing grassroots organizations, and they've taken upon themselves in Spain to try and mobilize civil society at large around Climate Assembly. So what they were doing while the assembly was happening, they were providing updates on what's going on, trying to coordinate kind of the calls among the key players among the civil society. They've also run social media campaigns and staged some I think it was like a march around the place where the recommendations, where the government was presented with recommendations. So there were some people who actually came out on the street to commemorate and to celebrate that happening. So I think one challenge that they've encountered was to get attention of the major players. And I think one learning from that, but also from other countries, is that you need, before the assembly starts, you need to secure champions in the civil society, and ideally champions from among big weights that actually can pull can actually help carry some of the burden in terms of mobilizing other members. And if you have already some institutional kind of setting, be it informal or formal, for civil society to coordinate on climate issues, that could be a good channel to actually mobilize around rather than trying to establish something new. Another example I want to share is from Austria, and we actually had a learning call on that some time ago at Knoca. So if you're interested, the recording is on our website. Austria has created a special function when they designed the Climate Assembly, the function of NGO, I think it was called Civil Society and Public Liaison Officers. It was shared among two colleagues, and they actually had a job of providing information and helping to kind of coordinate communication around Climate Assembly with civil society at large, and also kind of to the broader public. And I think that was really helpful in the Austrian context. I don't know if any Austrian colleagues are still here. I saw some of them earlier, but I think what we heard from them, that was very helpful to have that kind of central function of sharing information and helping, again, to coordinate among civil society institutions.
Yeah, I think the other assembly that might be worth, I think we've mentioned this, I've mentioned this to you before, I think is the assembly in Sweden that's just finished, because I think, if I'm right, they actually created a sort of reference group of influencers from across the sort of social and political spectrum who are used to working with the media, traditional and social media, because this is a really unusual kind of enterprise that you're engaged in, and having trusted intermediaries being the sort of taking the voice out, taking the ideas out into civil society, into media discussions is really helpful. So I hope that was helpful. And last question, I think, before we end, which is going to be from Kathy, who's from the Citizens Assembly Working Group from Extinction Rebellion in the UK. Kathy, I hope I didn't out you there live on Zoom, but do you want to share your question with us?
No, it's not a problem. I'm not ashamed. I'm very proud, actually, to be part of the rebellion. Yes, you partially answered or fed into sort of what I was thinking about, but in terms of climate assemblies being used as much as a platform to publicize and educate about deliberative democracy, I think there has been a failing and missed opportunities. I mean, I know for the People's Plan for Nature, I think Sophia sort of was implying that it was but it wasn't very well publicized. I knew loads of people who were members of RSPB and had no idea that a citizens' assembly was going on, and they had no real idea what it was. And, you know, these three groups had thousands of members, and it was a real opportunity to increase. That is one of my concerns about, you know, climate assemblies just remaining in a bubble. And but you seem to suggesting just your last comment, Graham, that there is a move to change that, to have influencers, but I really think it's a really important part, because you won't get public buy-in unless there's the understanding, you know, what's a citizens' assembly?
I think there was a natural expectation of us that that for us, those of us who ran assemblies, that everyone would just be excited about them. I mean, why couldn't they be? Because we are. And it was really interesting talking to somebody from someone who was a media expert. He just said to me, just because you find it interesting doesn't mean anyone else finds it interesting. And certainly you've got to find a better way of explaining what they are, rather than that sort of 4-line explanation about what an assembly is. So it is really important, I think, that, you know, we're nerds. The fact that you have turned up, not you, just you, Kathy, I mean, you are a nerd, but all of us in this space, the fact that you've turned up to this, the fact that if you're watching this on repeat, we are a strange bunch of people who spend our time thinking about this sort of stuff. And so we actually need to be aware that other people are going to be needed to translate this into ways of thinking that, and we haven't figured that out. So I think this kind of move that the Swedes did, I think actually, if I remember rightly, in the Biodiversity Assembly in Ireland, actually Arto Leary tried to get a couple of people who are TikTok influencers actually embedded within the assembly. And he also had somebody who was a very respected journalist from RTE, which is the broadcasting company, who attended every session and was reporting regularly from it. These are the sorts of things that we didn't build in naturally from the start, because we just thought everybody would be amazed about what we'd done. And I think we've actually got to start building that stuff in if we want it to have the kind of resonance that you're hoping for, Kathy. I think. Did Oisín or Alina, any thoughts on that?
Well, just to reiterate that one of the differences between the Climate Assembly and the Biodiversity Assembly was that the chair of the Climate Assembly was a retired High Court judge, and the chair of the Biodiversity Assembly was a celebrity academic. I mean, and I don't mean celebrity in this case as being pejorative, but she's a brilliant academic. She happened to have a really high public profile, independent of her academic record, and be a very excellent communicator. So it was quite an unusual combination that allowed them have a higher profile than they would have had otherwise.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on that, Alina, at all?
No, I guess to agree, we do have, and I think Noel put a comment in the chat that we have a major marketing and communication challenge, and yeah, I have to agree. Interestingly, I was at a meeting recently where investigative journalists are working on kind of environmental matters, but never actually having heard of climate assemblies. I started talking about what we do, and they got a bit interested. And I said, well, from your perspective as communicator, what would be the most exciting kind of message to pick on? And they said, definitely find a way to tell about the process. It's fascinating, the whole idea of democratic lottery and kind of mini country coming together. So it got me thinking that initially my kind of tendency was, well, let's focus on politics and policy impacts and that kind of technical stuff about process, just skip through it very quickly in your presentation. But for them, that was actually the most exciting thing about it. So I think we need to actually engage more with, I think, communication kind of specialists and journalists on that to identify how to get through, I suppose.
Yeah, I know that in France they spent a lot of time, if you like, building the capacity of journalists, of actually bringing them into the fold, giving them access in a way, you know, and treating them really well. And I think they had an enormous budget. It was like a €7 million budget, and €1 million of that they spent on comms. And I know that the Austrians also spent about €1 million on comms, and not surprisingly, those are the two that have had the most resonance in you've got to throw resource at it. And I think most of us are scratching around for money just to run the assembly. But actually, in a sense, this fits in with something that you were saying earlier, Oisín, is that if you don't think about what happens afterwards, about the kind of political process afterwards, or you don't think about the comms around it, then actually just doing it really well is, that's great in itself, but it's not going to necessarily get you anywhere.
And I think Alina touched on something very interesting there, that the process is quite interesting to some people when they hear more about it. And I think there's an important point there. I'm not quite sure how you make this spread, but like, citizens are used to having their opinions ignored. They're often feel alienated from the political class or from the elite, or from, even if your vote And obviously in the UK, your vote makes less of a difference than it does in a proportional system. So if you feel disempowered or alienated, the idea that one thing that Citizen Assembly does do for the 100 people in the room is that gives their opinions, ordinary citizens, real weight and really respects the common wisdom of a citizen given the time and space to deliberate. There could be something quite appealing, even if you're not in the room yourself, something quite appealing about that to other citizens, like how you exactly spread that or communicate that or in some way allow other citizens to feel empowered to express their views or participate in some, not pure like consultation, which is a bit boring for most people, like where maybe it's TikTok videos, but as opposed to written submissions, but something that uses that difference about citizens' assemblies to allow more people feel encouraged to participate. Is if you can unlock that, it could make a big difference.
I've got a friend who's a comedy writer, and he's just managed to get. He's got a major public production company really interested in a comedy he's trying to write about a citizens' assembly, because it's a radio comedy, and it's sort of, he just said, the diversity of people in it is just the comedy value of this is amazing. And the way that when people receive an invitation, a lot of people think it's some sort of scam because they're being offered money by the government. And I just think that sort of thing, if you could imagine a comedy going out at 6 o'clock in the evening in the UK, that would, or it being something that is mainstreamed within other kind of programs. That's the sort of thing. It's something people just need to be able to talk about it in ordinary ways. And I think at the moment, our communications efforts are just missing the mark, I'm afraid.
Yes, the depth of it as opposed to the thick of it.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. So that's something for English language listeners, I think. We're coming to the end, so I just wanted to say, Oisín and Alina, any sort of you've got a civil society organization and a chief exec from another organization, you're coming to you, Oisín, and saying someone's talking about running this thing called a citizens' assembly near me. What's the one piece of advice you would give them? And Alina, same for you.
Grab the opportunity with both hands. Like there are relatively few levers and opportunities that CSOs have for exercising influence, or if the lever isn't in our hands in this case, but there's relatively few opportunities where it's a relatively level playing field, where the evidence-based approach to climate policy has a fair shot and isn't competing against a lot of other noise. So a citizen assembly is one of those few places, and it's one of the biggest innovations in public policy making, and there aren't that many innovations in public policy making really in the long sweep of things. So when a citizen assembly is being done on climate, it is a real opportunity to progress your agenda, and with a real legitimate mandate from citizens, not just from professional NGO usual suspects, as will be described. So you've got to make the most of it.
And you forgot to say, here's Alina's really cool report that you
gave.
Exactly.
Alina, here's how you do it.
Yeah, apart from saying read my report, what's the one message you would give to, you've got what is it, your elevator pitch? What are you going to say to a CSO?
Yeah, I think Oisín did a wonderful job already summarizing that, but I would just say get in early. Use this to excite your staff, your constituencies, and politicians. And if in doubt, learn from those who have already been part of it.
Thank you. That's really great. And look, I want to just use this opportunity once again to thank Alina for putting this together, because as Oisín said, so many of the things that are out there are kind of generic. How do you run a citizens' assembly? Or lots of academic articles, lots of reports about how these things should be used in rather abstract terms. And I think what Alina has done is actually said, so you are a CSO, I want to help you think about it from where you are. And I think that's such an unusual thing to do. So Alina, from the rest of the Knoca community and those beyond, thank you so much for your work on this. I know it's been a long time coming for you. Lots of competing commitments, but it's really fantastic. It's a really great addition to what Knoca has done, and I'm really, really pleased about it. And I'd like to thank both you and Oisín and everyone else for being so open with their the conversation around this. I'll just use this opportunity to wish everybody, I mean, those of you in the Northern Hemisphere, obviously there are people watching this elsewhere. I'd like to wish you a great summer. We're going to go a bit quiet for the next month or two while we take a break. We've got a few things that we know are going to be happening or we hope are going to be happening in September. We'll confirm things in the next couple of days. We're hoping to have a learning call about the Swedish Climate Assembly early in September. As I've already mentioned, they did some really interesting work because they were very much focused on trying to influence public debate, which is the question that our Norwegian friends were asking us. So I think that's going to be a really interesting learning call. On a very personal note, I've got a book coming out on climate assemblies based on the learning that we've developed over the last 3 years through Knoca, and we're going to be launching that on the 26th of September. I'll more about that nearer the time. And we're also going to mark the 5th anniversary of the French Climate Assembly, the French Citizens Convention for the Climate. It just seems crazy. It was only 5 years ago. But there's lots of debate still about whether or not the French Climate Assembly was a success. Was it a failure? Did it have any impact or not? And we've just done a lot of, we've commissioned 3 groups of people, one to go away and look at policy impact. That's actually Alina again. Claire Mellier and Selma Tilliket are looking at more broadly of the impact, drawing on academic literature. And Jose Luis Fernandez and colleagues have been looking at the media impact of the French Assembly compared to other assemblies. So we're going to bring that all together in about October, November time. And we're going to ask the question about, so what was the convention worth doing, and what kind of impacts did it actually have? Certainly, I think we probably wouldn't all be sitting here if it hadn't happened, if we're honest. So listen, this has been a really great workshop. Well, not a workshop, a launch of Alina's playbook. It's not Alina's playbook, it's Knoca's playbook. Knoca's playbook, authored by Alina. Please do spread it far and wide. Please do spread it to civil society organizations. If you've got if you know of an assembly happening somewhere, send that to key actors, because I think it's going to be a really useful resource. So once again, we won't see you for a little while. We're taking a little break, but it's been a real pleasure. And yeah, see you all hopefully the other side of summer. Take care, everybody.